When the sun forgets the color of the skin that first worshipped it, history begins to rot. The stones remember. They always do. But men learn to forget. Across the sands of Kemet, the land of the black, the walls once spoke a language of light and lineage. Faces carved in obsidian hue, eyes lifted to roar. The sun that saw no race. Now, their names are worn away. Their features softened by centuries of deliberate silence. Each grain of sand, each broken nose, a record of something rewritten. The Nile still flows as it did when the first architects of time measured its flood. Yet the truth that moved with its waters, the truth of who they were, has been buried under papyrus and politics alike. In the museums of the world, their relics stand beneath foreign lights. Golden masks under European ceilings, brown skin rendered in beige on glossy textbooks. The gods of the Black Land, reimagined as pale myths for a pale history. And so, under the same sun that once crowned pharaohs, the question remains, who erased the face of Egypt? And why does the silence still echo louder than truth? The drone rises higher, revealing the Valley of the Kings as the light turns gold. Ancient chants fade beneath the wind, cut to black. They called it Kemet, the Black Land, not metaphor, not myth, but matter. The very soil beneath their feet, dark from the flood of the Nile, rich as the womb of creation. Each year, when the waters receded, the people gathered what the gods had left, a new layer of black silt, and from that silt, life began again. The word Kemet first appeared in the coffin texts and pyramid texts, inscribed deep inside the tombs of kings. It was not only geography, it was identity. In their sacred language, blackness was not absence, it was rebirth, divinity, the sacred color of Osiris, god of resurrection, whose skin was painted black to symbolize life after death. To call themselves the people of Kemet, Remechin Kemet, was to claim descent from the divine black soil, from the earth that birthed gods and men alike. But that name, Kemet, would not remain untouched. Between Nubia in the south and the Delta in the north lay the beating heart of Africa's first great civilization. Archaeological evidence from Custal, discovered by Bruce Williams in the 1960s, revealed royal incense burners etched with the same white crown later worn by the kings of unified Egypt. Symbols of kingship, born not in the north, but in Nubia. The UNESCO General History of Africa, Volume 2 records these finds as evidence that the roots of Egyptian civilization were deeply African, political, cultural, and biological, but that truth would soon be shadowed. In the Age of Empires, Egypt's image was rewritten. When Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt in 1798, he brought not only soldiers, but scholars. They catalogued, translated, and measured every ruin they found, compiling their discoveries into the monumental description de l'Egypte. It was the birth of Egyptology, and the beginning of Egypt's exile from Africa. By the 19th century, as Europe expanded its colonial reach, Egypt was no longer African in the eyes of the West. It became Mediterranean, a Near Eastern miracle, disconnected from the continent that bore it. The scholars Jean-François Champollion, Flinders Petrie, and others described the Egyptians as Asiatic in origin, their brilliance attributed to influences from the north and east. And as racial science emerged, this narrative hardened. Anthropologists like Samuel George Morton filled entire rooms with human skulls, ranking them by shape and size. He called it craniometry. But it was not science, it was justification. In these sterile rooms, Egypt was whitened, its gods repainted, its kings reclassified. The cradle of civilization was moved quietly, away from its mother continent, yet the ancient record still spoke. When Herodotus, the Greek historian called the father of history, visited Egypt around 440 BCE, he described the people plainly in Book 2, 104 of his histories. The Egyptians are black-skinned and have woolly hair. The Greeks saw what the stones showed, but in later centuries, those same words were dismissed as misinterpretation, climate confusion, or translation error, and still, the truth resurfaced again and again. In the 20th century, African scholars like Cheikh Anta Diop and Théophile Obinger returned to the language itself. They found that the ancient Egyptian tongue shared core linguistic roots with Wolof, Yoruba, and other sub-Saharan languages. Their research, presented before UNESCO in 1974, challenged every racialized notion of Egypt's origin. They showed that DNA, art, and language all pointed south to Africa. Diop warned, when a people lose the right to their past, they lose the power to define their future. And he was right, because even before Diop, even before Herodotus, the truth had been seen, and then quietly erased. Volney, an 18th century French philosopher, stood before the ruins of Thebes and wrote, "Those venerable men whose images I behold were black like the Negroes. The race of men now despised were the same who founded our arts, sciences, and religions." Even Champollion, in his private letters, admitted that the faces he saw on temple walls were of the black race, though he never published it. To speak such truth in his century was to threaten an empire's illusion. So what are we told? That Egypt was a miracle apart from Africa, that the pyramids were the work of outsiders, that skin color was irrelevant to civilization, and yet the records say otherwise. The art, the mummies, the genetic trails all tell one story, that the builders of Kemet were of Africa, from Africa, and for millennia they called themselves children of the Black Land, who benefits when the cradle of civilization is moved away from its mother continent, who profits when the first scientists, mathematicians, and physicians are stripped of their color and their name. And what happens when you rename a god and repaint his skin? This is how erasure survives, not through lies, but through silence, through the slow, careful redefinition of truth until the descendants of Kemet themselves begin to doubt their inheritance. But the Black Land still breathes beneath the desert. Its symbols are carved into the stone that refuse to die. Every statue, every glyph, every buried crown is a whisper that says, "Remember me." If history itself can be rewritten, then who writes yours? Like, comment, and subscribe, not for vanity, but for vigilance. Because this story is only beginning to wake. History does not die when forgotten. It dies when it is replaced. This is the descent, the cost of erasing truth. When the 19th century began its hunger for origins, the scholars who held the pen began their conquest, not of land, but of memory. Europe was carving maps, and Egypt was its trophy. In 1885, a Haitian scholar named Antenna Firmin published a book the world was not ready to read, The Equality of the Human Races. He wrote with precision, not passion. He compared skulls, languages, and measurements, and concluded that civilization did not begin in Europe's image. He proved that the ancient Egyptians were African, and that race was a political illusion. But the halls of anthropology were close to him. His work was mocked, shelved, and silenced, not for its lack of rigor, but for the color of the hands that wrote it. Firmin's research lay buried under decades of academic dust, while lesser theories built on prejudice, became truth. A century later, Cheikh Anta Diop, the Senegalese physicist, linguist, and historian, picked up the same torch. In the laboratories of the Sorbonne, he analyzed bone structure, melanin content, and linguistic heritage. He proved that Egypt was the child of Africa, not an orphan of the Mediterranean. But his studies were denied funding, his theses rejected, his results branded ideological. UNESCO eventually invited him to contribute to the general history of Africa. Yet even there, his name was spoken carefully, like a warning. This was the cost of challenging history written in marble and ink. Each scholar's silence became a kind of burial, each retraction a tombstone. Walk through the museums, look closer. The faces on the statues, broad-nosed, full-lipped, are labeled mixed race. The bust of Mentuhotep II, founder of the Middle Kingdom, is dark basalt, unmistakably African. Yet his description reads, possibly of Asiatic descent. The papyrus of Ani, translated and reprinted for Western classrooms, omits the ancient word, the Black Land. Entire verses describing divine rebirth in the darkness of the seed were replaced with abstractions. The gods were depigmented, their hair reinterpreted as ornament, not texture. Under British rule, between 1882 and 1956, Egyptology became an imperial science. Artifacts were extracted, catalogued, and displayed under foreign names. The meaning of discovery twisted into ownership. When Nubian tombs, near Custal revealed crowns and incense burners, older than Egypt's first dynasties, the Sudan Antiquities Service, under Anglo-Egyptian administration, sealed the findings. Files were marked confidential. Access was denied. In Western textbooks, the 25th dynasty, the Nubian pharaohs who restored Egypt's monuments and revived its ancient religion, were branded as foreign invaders. Their reign of Renaissance recast as occupation. Even in modern Egypt, the acknowledgement of black African lineage is a quiet taboo, erased by nationalism, shadowed by tourism, muted by politics. And so, the descendants of Kemet learn their ancestors through foreign tongues, through museum labels that whisper half-truths, through scholars who reimagine Africa as a backdrop, never the stage, statues, eyes that seem to stare back. How many voices were buried, not in sand, but in silence? What does it mean when a civilization must whiten its ancestors to keep its glory? Who decides what humanity remembers and what it must forget? The hum deepens like a pulse under the earth. The truth does not vanish, it waits, and when the silence can no longer hold it, it returns as a reckoning. This is the reckoning, revelation and exposure. For centuries, the debate over who the Egyptians was built not on evidence, but on ownership. Yet truth, when unearthed, is patient in its precision. In Abydos el-Malak, a burial site south of Cairo, DNA extracted from ancient mummies revealed a genetic signature once thought impossible. The genomes, preserved across dynasties, showed continuous ties to sub-Saharan Africa, not isolation from it. This finding, published in Nature Communications in 2017, struck at the root of an illusion that Egypt had somehow existed apart from its continent. Even in death, the ancestors refused to lie. Thousands of years earlier, before the pyramids, before written kingship, the people of Nabta Playa carved circles of stone into the desert. There, 10,000 years ago, a pastoral civilization mapped the stars, tracked solstices, and worshipped the cattle that gave life. These were the first architects of cosmology in Africa. Their sacred patterns and alignments predate Stonehenge by millennia. From them rose the agricultural and spiritual blueprint that would become Kemet. When Egypt was unified, the lineage of Toseti, the first nome of Upper Egypt, rooted in what is now Nubia, carried the symbols of divine kingship, crowns, incense burners, and ceremonial objects discovered in the Custal tombs of Nubia bore the same iconography later used by Egyptian pharaohs. History did not begin in the north. It ascended from the south, yet the narrative of conquest replaced that of continuity. When the Kushite pharaohs Apai, Shoboka, and Taharqa rose from Nopata and restored Egypt's temples, they were called invaders. But the records, carved in hieroglyphs, tell a different story. They prayed in the ancient tongue, they rebuilt sanctuaries. They revived Mat, balance, justice, truth. Their reign was not an occupation, it was a resurrection. Across the tombs and temple walls, the faces remained faithful to Africa's palette. Broad noses, full lips, coiled hair, depicted without apology. The gods themselves, Ra, Osiris, and Tod, were painted in tones of earth and ebony. For the people of Kemet, the color black was the color of life. It was the hue of the fertile Nile soil, Kemet, the black land, and the symbol of rebirth. To be black was to be renewed, to be white, in their symbology, was to be lifeless, the color of bone and desert. The UNESCO Symposium of 1974, held in Cairo, sought to answer a question that had divided the academic world for a century. Were the ancient Egyptians African? Cheikh Anta Diop and Théophile Obinger stood before an audience of Western scholars with data, not rhetoric. Diop presented melanin dosage tests from preserved mummies, linguistic parallels between Wolof and ancient Egyptian, and anthropological correlations across sub-Saharan populations. The evidence was empirical, the reaction was political. The transcripts of that symposium were quietly archived, never fully circulated, a verdict without closure. Yet every silence leaves a trace. W.E.B. Du Bois, decades earlier, wrote that Egypt was an African state, and the earliest culture of the world was African. He was dismissed, then quoted posthumously by those who once rejected him. Ivan van Sertima and Runoko Ishidi retraced the African diaspora through time, connecting bloodlines scattered by trade, empire, and denial. They followed the symbols and found the same ancestral script repeating across continents. Truth moves like the Nile, sometimes hidden beneath silt, sometimes roaring in flood. And like the Nile, it cannot be dammed forever. Once, there was a library that held nearly all the knowledge of the ancient world. The Library of Alexandria, built under Ptolemaic rule, preserved scrolls from Egypt, Greece, Mesopotamia, and beyond. When it burned, it was not only paper that turned to ash, but lineage. The voices of Kemet, its theology, its science, its cosmology, were erased in the name of empire and religion. 1,000 years of human memory, lost. When Napoleon's armies marched into Egypt in 1798, they carried cannons and compasses and took everything. Statues, sarcophagi, mummies, and manuscripts were looted, catalogued, and shipped to Paris. The Description de l'Egypte, produced by French scholars, redefined Egyptian imagery, lighter skin tones, European facial structures, sanitized hieroglyphs. The West had rediscovered Egypt and remade it in its own reflection. In the early 20th century, anthropology tried to turn race into geometry. Skulls were measured, faces classified, bloodlines sorted. And when the lies could no longer hold, when the world saw the cost of such science in the ashes of war, the archives were cleansed. References to racial typology were scrubbed from Egyptological journals after World War II, not because they were wrong, but because they were embarrassing. Still, the evidence endures. It sleeps in the bones beneath the desert. It speaks in the stone that remembers its sculptor's hand. It breathes in the soil that turned black after every flood, the sacred proof of rebirth. If knowledge is power, who decides what is worth remembering? If blackness was once the color of divinity, who turned it into shame? And what if every erased name, every broken nose on a statue, was never vandalism, but a warning? The reckoning has begun. The truth does not need belief. It only needs to be seen. The story does not end in the tombs of kings. It ends where memory begins again. For centuries, the name Kemet was left to sleep beneath another. Egypt, a word shaped by foreign tongues, a reflection through borrowed glass. But the earth does not forget its own name. Today, across Africa and beyond, scholars and seekers reclaim what was never lost, only misnamed. In universities from Dakar to Addis Ababa, in archives once locked by empire, the word Kemet breathes again. It stands not just for a nation, but for an inheritance of mind, mathematics, medicine, philosophy, astronomy, the first language of civilization. Modern Egypt and Sudan still share its veins, the Nile flowing between them like memory itself. Colonial borders carve the land, but not the bloodline. In the faces of Nubian farmers, in the dark skin of southern Egyptians, the old kingdom still endures, living history against the silence of museums. In the 20th century, as Africa rose from the weight of colonial rule, its children reached back to Kemet to find themselves. Marcus Garvey spoke of Africa as divine soil, the mother of nations, the nation of Islam, and later the Kemetic revival movements across America and the Caribbean drew from the symbols of Mat, Ra, and Tal, reclaiming what centuries had called foreign. Even now, murals, temples, and digital archives rise across the diaspora, piecing together fragments of a stolen story. DNA projects trace migrations, once erased from maps. Artists resurrect faces from the sand. Historians reconstruct lineages from the silence of papyrus. Yet the question remains, what is power, if not the right to remember? Every empire that rewrites its origin is the language of its soul. Every civilization that forgets its roots becomes a ruin long before the stones fall. Perhaps the truest power lies not in who built the pyramids, but in who remembers them. Because memory is not history, it is resistance. The same figure remains, carved from black stone, half buried, half seen. The sun dips low, painting the horizon in blood and ash. The shadow of the statue stretches long across the black land. Once more, the world forgets what color the sun first rose upon. But beneath the dust, the soil is still dark. The land still carries its name, Kemet, the Black Land. The place where gods remembered. They were born of men. You've heard their names whispered again. Don't let them fade. Share this story. Comment what you've uncovered and subscribe, because history isn't dead. It's buried, waiting for you to dig. I am only a messenger. The rest is yours to remember.